He stripped her dignity, then froze when she took the bench. Deputy Kyle Mercer had spent 13 years turning his badge into a weapon, using protocol as a shield to humiliate the very people the courthouse was meant to protect. So when he pulled Nadine Carter, a quiet black woman, out of line and marched her into a windowless room, he didn't see a threat. He didn't see a judge. He saw someone to control, someone to break. But when they picked Nadine Carter, they didn't know who they were messing with. They didn't know she was a federal judge with the power to dismantle everything they'd buried. And what came next wasn't just justice. It was a reckoning that exposed an entire system of silence and complicity. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because the story you're about to hear isn't just about one man. It's about all of us. Sunlight filtered through the courthouse blinds, casting long shadows across the empty rows of benches. The room was still, but the air carried weight, like it knew something was about to shift. Because when Judge Carter walked back in, the law itself felt different. They told her to step out of line, and in that moment, everything changed. Nadine Carter wasn't just another woman walking into the Jefferson County Courthouse. She was a federal judge with 22 years on the bench, and a spine forged from decades of quiet resistance. But that morning, dressed in a navy suit and low heels, carrying a worn leather portfolio, she chose, like always, not to wear her robe through security. She believed justice should enter humbly, not with fanfare. Deputy Kyle Mercer didn't see a judge. He saw a black woman walking alone, and he saw a target. "You don't look like anyone important," he muttered, eyes narrowing. When Nadine presented her credentials, he didn't even glance at them. He took the badge and slipped it into his pocket. "Just a routine check," he said, already steering her away from the line into a windowless security room. Her voice remained calm. "I do not consent to this." He didn't answer. Instead, he locked the door. Inside, under flickering fluorescent lights and cold silence, 2 more officers joined him. One of them, barely more than a boy, looked nervous but said nothing. Nadine was forced into a metal chair, her arms pinned as Mercer powered up a pair of clippers and said, "Let's see what you're hiding under that hair." She didn't scream when the first coil of silver fell. She didn't plead when her scalp buzzed with vibration and humiliation. She sat there, stoic, as pieces of herself dropped to the floor like unwanted history. Laughter echoed from the corner of the room. "Might have done her a favor," one guard chuckled. Mercer wiped his hand on his vest. "There. Now you look like you belong." Pause here, friend. What would you do if someone tried to strip you of your dignity, right in the heart of a place meant to protect it? Nadine's hands clenched in her lap, but her voice, when it came, was steel wrapped in velvet. "You will regret this." Mercer smirked, opened the door, and waved her out like she was nothing. But that was his mistake, because she wasn't nobody. She wasn't there to observe or defend or plead. She was there to preside. And in just minutes, the very court that had mocked her would rise as she took her rightful place on the bench, bald but unbroken. Isn't it strange how people forget the power of a person once you strip away the symbols? And yet, sometimes what they take from you becomes the very fire that lights the reckoning ahead. The courtroom was already half full when Nadine Carter pushed open the double doors. Not from the judge's private entrance, as protocol dictated, but from the same hallway where defendants, reporters, and staff walked. Heads turned, conversations stuttered and stalled. Some faces tensed in confusion, others in veiled discomfort. Her scalp, newly shorn and uneven, caught the overhead lights like a fresh wound, raw and undeniable. She walked with steady grace down the center aisle, past the whispers, past the stares, past the very guards who had stripped her hours earlier, now posted near the doors like statues pretending not to remember. But they remembered. Everyone remembered. Her robe lay folded neatly over the judge's bench, untouched. She didn't wait for a bailiff to announce her. She didn't wait for permission. Nadine Carter climbed the steps to the bench, picked up her robe with slow, deliberate hands, and slipped it on as if wrapping herself in battle armor. Then, calm, composed, she turned to face the room. The very air seemed to contract. A reporter dropped their pen. One of the clerks, young, unsure, couldn't meet her eye. And Mercer? He stood frozen by the side door, face pale, lips parted like he'd seen a ghost. She met his gaze, not with fury, but with the kind of cold silence that comes when a woman knows exactly who she is. She lowered herself into the chair with poise, as if nothing had happened, because in a way, everything had. "Is the docket ready?" she asked the clerk. The girl stammered, "Yes, Your Honor." Nadine nodded once, and her voice never wavered as she opened proceedings. "We will begin today with preliminary testimony in Case 418B, State of Georgia versus Atlanta Police Department. Charges include excessive force and civil rights violations." Murmurs swept through the gallery. Lawyers shuffled, defendants shifted in their seats, but no one spoke too loudly, no one scoffed now. The woman they had watched walk through the halls as if invisible was suddenly undeniable. Her authority didn't come from the robe. It radiated from the core of someone who had been publicly broken and stood back up anyway. Do you feel that weight in your chest? That quiet ache when dignity is reclaimed, not with rage, but with poise? Nadine did not call Mercer forward. Not yet. But from the corner of her eye, she saw him slowly retreat toward the exit, shrinking under the very silence he once wielded like a weapon. Let that settle for a moment. How quickly does a man unravel when he realizes the person he tried to destroy holds the power to judge him in return? Nadine didn't need to raise her voice. The room was already listening, not out of fear, but out of recognition. A reckoning had entered the courtroom, and it was wearing a robe. She waited until the second witness stepped down. Then the room changed. Nadine Carter sat motionless on the bench, her hands folded, her gaze steady. "Deputy Mercer," she said, her voice slicing through the still air like a clean blade. He froze mid-step near the side exit. "Step forward." The gallery fell into a hush so deep you could hear the tick of the old courtroom clock. Mercer turned, face drained of color, and walked toward the center like a man approaching the gallows. Nadine never raised her voice, but her authority was absolute. "State your name for the record." "Kyle Mercer," he mumbled, barely audible. "How long have you worked in this courthouse?" 13 years. Nadine nodded slowly. "And in those 13 years, how many women have you escorted into that screening room alone?" Mercer shifted, eyes darting, seeking rescue. None came. I don't remember." Nadine's tone never cracked, but it grew colder. 12 formal complaints, dozens more undocumented. You hid behind protocol, behind silence. But today, silence is no longer an option. Her words settled like a weight across the room. The courtroom wasn't just listening, they were bracing. Mercer stammered. "Your Honor, I didn't know who you were." Nadine leaned forward, her voice firm but controlled. "And that's exactly the problem. You didn't need to know who I was. You saw a black woman and assumed she was no one. You didn't ask for my name. You didn't see the badge. You saw something to control, to violate, to humiliate." The words hit like thunder. Mercer's shoulders sagged. His lips moved, but no sound came. Nadine stood. "Because of you, this courthouse, a place meant for justice, became a place of fear." She turned to the officers at the back. "Take him into custody." "Separate holding. Charges forthcoming." The snap of handcuffs echoed like punctuation. Mercer cried out, "You can't do this!" Nadine didn't flinch. "I already have." And just like that, the power shifted. Not just in the room, but in the institution itself. For years, Mercer had been untouchable, protected by a system that prioritized appearances over accountability. But now, the mask was off, and when one mask falls, others often follow. "Can you feel it?" This moment when justice stops whispering and finally speaks out loud. Nadine sat back down, robe draped like steel over her shoulders. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply looked at the names on her docket and said, "We will proceed." And in the silence that followed, something old crumbled. Something new began. There was no applause when she stood, no triumphant music swelling behind her robe, just the sound of breath being held across a courtroom that had learned, at last, how to listen. Judge Nadine Carter raised a manila folder high enough for both tables to see. "This," she said, voice unwavering, "is a policy proposal that will take effect immediately." No one moved. No one dared. "It's called the Carter Mandate." A rustle of tension moved through the gallery. "From this day forward, every courthouse employee under this jurisdiction, bailiffs, marshals, administrative staff, will undergo mandatory anti-bias training, quarterly psychological screening, and full transparency in misconduct investigations. No more loopholes, no more hidden complaints, no more silence." She paused, not for dramatics, but for gravity. "And let me be clear," she continued, "this is not about revenge. It's about responsibility, about restoring faith in an institution that should never have allowed a man like Kyle Mercer to thrive unchecked." The courtroom was so still you could hear the hum of the overhead lights. A defense attorney at the back rose, careful and composed. "Your Honor, we submit that given recent events, you may be personally compromised. We ask that you recuse yourself." Nadine didn't let him finish. She stepped down from the bench and walked slowly to the edge of the platform. "You think because I was assaulted, I can't be impartial?" Her tone was steady, but behind it was a tremor not of weakness, but of restraint. "Let me ask you, what does it say about this court that a black woman must prove her neutrality after being humiliated in its own halls, while the men who inflicted it never once had to prove theirs?" She let the question hang there, unanswered. If justice falters every time someone in power feels discomfort, then we are not practicing justice. We are performing it. She turned back to the gallery. "I will not step down. I will not be silenced. And if this court cannot function unless it pretends abuse never happened, then this court should not function at all." A long breath followed. Can you feel it? That moment when principle outweighs fear, when the line is drawn not in anger but in clarity? Nadine tapped the bench once. This court is in session. And in that instant, it was no longer just about a hearing, or a defendant, or even a rogue deputy. It was about a system being confronted by the very thing it tried for decades to suppress: truth with a voice, and power without apology. It began not with headlines, but with a whisper on the courthouse steps, an older woman in a church hat clutching Nadine Carter's hand and saying, "You gave us back our voice." From there, the reckoning rippled outward. The Carter Mandate wasn't just a policy anymore. It was a symbol, a fire spreading courtroom to courtroom. Other judges called, cities asked for copies, a bill was introduced in Congress, but Nadine never chased the spotlight. She returned each morning to her bench, hair still close-cropped, robe hanging heavy but earned, deciding child custody cases, housing disputes, wrongful terminations, because justice in her view was not about grandeur, but consistency. And yet, something had shifted. The janitor nodded each morning. A young attorney started carrying her file like it was sacred. Even the bailiffs stood straighter, not from fear, but from respect. Then came the call from the White House. Nadine was to receive the Presidential Medal of Justice. The ceremony would be televised. She agreed, but only on one condition. The front row must be filled not with politicians, but with those who had stood beside her. Her sister Nayan, her former intern, now a first-year law student, Reverend Hill, and Megan, the clerk who had once trembled as she whispered, "I saw what they did." As Nadine stepped onto the stage, lights glaring, applause rising like a tide, she didn't wave. She simply took the microphone and began. "I wasn't supposed to be here, not because I didn't earn it, but because people like me weren't imagined into these rooms." Her voice didn't crack, it clarified. I didn't survive that day because I was special. I survived because I'd been trained to carry the weight of silence. But silence doesn't serve justice, it serves power. She looked to the cameras, but spoke past them. This isn't my medal. It's for every woman who was told to sit still. Every man who was told justice wasn't for him. Every child who watched the law and saw only fear. She paused. Because some words deserve room to breathe. Do you feel it now? That thrum in your chest when someone finally speaks the truth you've been waiting your whole life to hear? When the ceremony ended, Nadine stepped off the stage into a sea of quiet nods and tearful eyes. And hundreds of miles away, in a dim prison rec room, Kyle Mercer watched the broadcast in silence. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. He simply stared as the woman he once tried to erase became the very symbol of what he feared most: accountability. Nadine Carter didn't just change a courtroom. She changed the weather in every room she entered. And as the years moved on, people didn't just remember the ruling. They remembered the woman who refused to shrink. Sometimes, dignity isn't something we speak. It's something we hold quietly, even when the world tries to take it from us. Nadine Carter's story reminds us that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it walks back into the room after being humiliated, lifts its head, and carries on with grace. Many of us know what it feels like to be overlooked, dismissed, or told, directly or in silence, that we don't belong. But the truth is, the world changes not just through grand gestures, but through steady courage, through standing tall when it would be easier to shrink. We may not wear robes or gavels, but we carry our own authority, in the way we treat others, in the way we respond to hurt without hardening, and in the way we keep showing up. So, if you've ever been made to feel small, remember, your story doesn't end there. The quiet strength you've built over a lifetime matters. It teaches, it heals, and sometimes just by holding your ground, you help others find their voice too. She stood on her front porch at dusk, no cameras, no crowds, just the soft hush of wind through oak trees and the quiet thrum of her own breath. Her scalp, once stripped in shame, now shimmered with silver stubble under the fading light. There was no applause, no ceremony, only stillness. And in that stillness, Nadine Carter had never felt stronger. Because survival, when done with grace, becomes its own kind of justice. The courthouse had changed, but not just the policies or the names on the doors. It was in the way people looked at each other now, in how silence was no longer treated as safety, but as betrayal, in how truth was no longer feared, but expected. What came next would be harder. Rebuilding trust, digging out the roots of old wrongs, and keeping the fire lit long after the headlines faded. But someone had to do it, and she had already begun. If this story stayed with you, share it. Subscribe to Echoes of Racism so these voices don't fade into silence. In the meantime, I've chosen 2 stories I think will move you just as much. Take care and we'll see you soon.